Hello, everybody, and welcome to another session of the Ghoul Guides Association. We are your Ghoul Guides, of course. I am Lauren.
And I'm Mary.
And today we're going to be talking about a merry thing. It's a merry episode. So I do actually know this time what this thing is, but I don't know much about it. And the reason I don't know much about it will become quite clear when we start talking about it. But I think it's going to be a good one. So yeah, before we get started, Mary Going, Dr. Mary Miss Going, how are you? How are things?
I'm doing good. Yeah, doing good. It's getting darker. It's been rainy. Halloween was good.
Yeah. Did you watch any
spooky.
spooky movies?
I did, yeah.
What did you watch?
I watched a Halloween anthology film that Trick or Treat. I was like, I've completely forgotten the title of it, but it's Trick or Treat. So yeah, watched a really fun Halloween anthology film. How about you? How are you?
I'm good.
What have you been doing?
I went to Comic-Con in London, so I dressed up all weekend. Not spooky, but I dressed up, so I appeased the spirits with my dressing up. And then I watched absolutely no scary movies because I am a massive chicken shit. I watched Over the Garden Wall instead, which if you haven't seen it, why not?
I think that's appropriately spooky.
Oh, it's so spooky. To be fair, it's actually really creepy, especially the bit with the highwaymen. But it's very Poe inspired, very Hawthorne inspired, real New England Gothic. But yeah, I watched no spooky movies because I can't watch scary films because I jump too easily. Put it in a novel and I'm absolutely fine, maybe even a graphic novel. Put it on screen, lose my tiny mind, which I think is a good segue to what we're going to talk about, or at least what you're going to tell me about today.
Yeah, so I kind of got this idea last year. So it must have been over the summer. There was a Friday the 13th, and me and my partner watched all of the Friday the 13th films.
I remember you telling me.
And it kind of started a kind of franchise sort of movie watch sort of thing.
Binge.
Yeah, that it's still kind of ongoing. We just pick a franchise and then we watch them all. But yeah, I've been kind of like wrestling with this idea a little bit. So today, what I'm talking about is slasher franchises. So first of all, like, you might be thinking one of either two things. The first one being like, slasher films, obviously they're Gothic because it's horror. But you might also be thinking slasher films, obviously they're not Gothic because horror and Gothic are two different things that are separate, and we shouldn't assume that one is the same as the other. And from my perspective, I think that both sides are right.
There's a nice big overlap in the Venn diagram.
I think they are. I think the best way to look at these genres is as kind of like sister genres, where they each have their own kind of specificities, and there are things that you can talk about horror films that don't really apply to Gothic, to the Gothic mode or to Gothic literature. And the same, like, there's things that apply to the Gothic mode or Gothic literature that don't apply to horror films. But there's also a lot of overlap. So I think Crimson Peak is a really good example of a Gothic horror film. Not all horror films are necessarily Gothic, but some are. And Crimson Peak is just such a beautiful and fabulous Radcliffean Gothic film.
Which is why I think that film got like some bad reviews, because people went in thinking it was a horror.
Yeah.
And it's not. It's a Gothic horror.
Yeah,
that's why it's one of the few that I have watched.
Yeah, and I think that like there are some things in horror as well that we can appreciate as being part of a Gothic legacy. So I think, like the found footage film is just another kind of way of doing the found document, which is, part of the inspiration of Gothic itself, but obviously in a different mode or a different media. But there are connections there. So what I want to do in today's episode is talk about slasher franchises through the lens of the Gothic, while also appreciating that there are lots of things about the slasher films and franchises that are specific to horror, and that Gothic isn't the only way that we can read these films, or necessarily should be the only way that we should read these films. So to any kind of horror specialist out there, don't worry, you do important work. I'm not stepping on your toes. I just think, you know, both Gothicists both Gothicists and horror scholars, I think there's a lot to kind of learn from each other. This is just
cool.
Yeah, there we go. That's the kind of intro.
Nice. I'm on board.
Cool. Okay, so obviously there's quite a lot of slasher franchises anyway. So what we'll be doing in this episode is just focusing on 3. Just because we need to narrow it down somehow.
We're talking about like 30-40 years of cinema, I think, here.
It's getting probably to about 50 plus years of cinema now. So what I've done is I've chosen some that you, Lauren, as someone who is not a fan of horror films and especially violent horror films, should have some kind of knowledge of, even if you haven't watched the films.
Okay, so they're in the like cultural consciousness.
Yes, they are. So also the other thing to say about these 3 franchises is that they all started in what's known as the golden era of slasher films, which is the
1790s. That's my period, Mary. Back off.
The 1970s and the 1980s. And also they're all pretty much still going today, which I think is quite interesting. But before we get started, what I want to ask you, Lauren, is, can you guess what these 3 franchises are?
I am gonna go with Halloween, Friday the 13th.
Yeah.
Which one is Friday the 13th and which one is Halloween? One's Freddy and one's Jason, right? Or is there another one?
There's another one. There's another one.
on Elm Street.
Yes. There
we go.
Yeah, there we go. See?
There we go. I know my stuff.
Okay, so I'm just gonna give like a little quick summary. Halloween. So you haven't actually mentioned the kind of like the I guess the monster, the killer in Halloween.
Oh, is that Michael Myers?
Yes, it is. So Michael Myers with that kind of, with the head, with the mask.
Those of you that listen to our Hellfire Club episode, there's another Stranger Things reference, right? Because doesn't Eddie wear the Michael Myers mask when they're
does, yeah. So Halloween is directed by John Carpenter, who also scored its absolutely banging synth soundtrack. And I will say about all of these franchises, they have amazing soundtracks. And so if you're ever needing something to kind of put on that doesn't have lyrics, that you can just listen to while you're working, just put on one of these slasher soundtracks. They're great. They're synthy. Amazing. It was first released in 1978, and its latest installment was actually this year, just a few weeks ago. Halloween Ends. So, still ongoing. The original idea of the film was basically that a psychotic killer had escaped from a sanitarium and was stalking and then murdering babysitters on Halloween. So it's very important that it takes place on Halloween. And Carpenter has, in interviews about the concept of the film, said that it was basically about Halloween night. Halloween had never been the theme in a film, and my idea was to do an old haunted house film. So again, if you think about that concept of like a haunted house, you can see like there's already quite a lot of like Gothic-y or Gothic infused kind of foundations. In total, there have been 13 Halloween films.
Oh, what a perfect number.
yeah, well, exactly. Very, very good for our next franchise. And like it helped to popularize quite a lot of tropes that are well known in
this one as well. Like, am I right in thinking that Halloween was semi-inspired by a real murder? There was a babysitter, I think, who like went missing and then was found murdered or something, like while she was babysitting.
I think that is a lot of speculation.
Okay.
But it was inspired by another film, which I will get to in a little bit.
Okay.
So we can maybe talk about that
awesome.
a little more. But yeah, obviously 13, very spooky number. So let's just briefly talk about Friday the 13th. So the first film in this franchise was released in 1980, and it was in part to capitalize on the success of Halloween. So Carpenter comes out with this, amazingly successful Halloween horror film that kind of starts the slasher kind of genre. And so
yeah and they were like, what's the next spookiest day of the year?
Yes, well, the other thing is that obviously Halloween is set in a kind of American suburbs, but this franchise takes place against the backdrop of Crystal Lake, so the lake is very important, and it's also against a kind of American camp.
This is the summer camp one.
Yeah, so there's always a group of kind of teenage camp counselors who are murdered one by one by the kind of slasher. And I think you've already mentioned his name before, but can you guess the slasher of this film?
It is either Freddy or Jason.
Yeah, so it's Jason Voorhees, who wears the
hockey mask.
The hockey mask. Yes. Yeah. And I don't know
if you know things about things.
I don't know if you can see it, but I have a little kind of
yeah, I can see
Jason mug that I put a spider plant in.
Amazing.
But okay, do you know that actually Jason isn't the killer in the original film?
No, I didn't know that, because it's supposed, isn't it like an urban legend that they tell about the camp?
They have lots of kind of like camp stories where they talk about different killers and things, and there's lots of legends, and definitely as the franchise kind of goes on, there's more legends, obviously, because Jason is then a part of it. But my next question is, do you know or can you guess who the first killer is?
I'm guessing it's like one of the camp counselors.
No.
Who is it?
So it's actually his mother.
Oh yes, because like, is this the one where like he was killed or like bullied or something, and his mom's like getting revenge? It's like a reverse Psycho. Exactly,
yeah. There's so much kind of like Psycho in this kind of like film narrative. So it's and I also think, I think Friday the 13th is my favorite of all the franchises, or at least in terms of the killers, because I'm like, I feel so sorry for Jason. He basically is disabled and disfigured, and he's bullied and left out. He's at this camp. His mum, Pamela Voorhees, works there, and the camp counselors are off
doing the sins,
and he drowns in the lake as a child on his birthday, Friday the 13th. So years later, she, in the first film, kind of decides to get revenge on a different group of camp counselors, as you do,
of course.
I just think it's really, really interesting. And what I also find really interesting, so he comes in the second film, and then he is the kind of the killer of the second film, but he actually doesn't get his mask until the third film. Yeah, so we all think, Friday the 13th, Jason Voorhees, hockey mask, but that's not, you don't actually get there until like the third film, which I just think is really really interesting. But yeah, okay, so in total there have been 12 Friday the 13th films, including a crossover film with our final franchise, Nightmare on Elm Street, where it's Freddy versus Jason. Also an installment where we have a copycat Jason killer. So it's not actually Jason, it's just someone pretending to be Jason, which is quite ridiculous. And also a film where Jason goes to space.
Sure.
Why not? It's actually one of my favorites, just because it's really funny.
Why not?
But yeah, okay, so the latest film was released way back in 2009, and it starred Supernatural alum Jared Padalecki, who is in the middle.
That one.
There haven't been any recent additions, because there's been like a massive like court battle over the rights. This might have been sorted, so there might just very well be a TV series, maybe a film.
Interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if they make a TV series, actually, because that's like horror TV series are quite popular, especially like nostalgia ones are very popular at the minute.
And it's also just to get around the different rights and things, because you might have the film rights but not the TV rights, which is exactly what happened with Chucky.
Yes,
that's why we have a Chucky TV series. But yeah, okay. Then finally we have A Nightmare on Elm Street. So the first film in this franchise was released in 1984, so you know, quite close together. Yeah. And it was written and directed by horror icon Wes Craven.
Yes,
I
did know that.
And this one is probably the most supernatural of the three, although will get into this a little bit more.
So this is the one where he kills them in their dreams, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask you about that.
I remember thinking that even though like the other ones are scary because they're real people, this one the concept has always creeped me out the most.
Yes. And we are going to come back to that idea of, are slasher films supernatural or are they not? And we're going to look at, you know, Halloween and Friday the 13th as well. But Nightmare on Elm Street, like you say, the concept initially straight away, this is supernatural. It's basically about a sleep demon or some kind of thing that's haunting dreams. And then like in Elm Street, there's a bunch of teenagers who keep having this figure haunting their dreams, turning them into nightmares, and then killing them. And the kind of the thing or the person that is killing them is a man called Freddy Krueger, who in his lifetime was basically a paedophile.
Oh, wonderful.
He's murdered by the parents of the teenagers, in a kind of, you know, mob justice kind of thing. We're just going to kill this man and not let him go through, you know, the legal system. Justice. Yeah, and then he starts by killing the kids of the parents who were involved. But yeah, like I think again, like one of the reasons why Jason is my favorite over Freddy is because I'm like, Freddy is literally a paedophile.
Yeah, just a terrible person.
Yeah, absolutely terrible. So since its release, there have been 9 films, including the kind of crossover, and also a TV series called Freddy's Nightmare, where he basically acted as a kind of like horror host for an anthology TV series. And there haven't been any additions to the franchise since its latest installment in 2010, which is essentially a remake. But again, coming back to one of our favorite TV shows, you can see the legacy of, you know, Krueger and A Nightmare on Elm Street with Stranger Things.
Yes,
as we have talked about. And Robert Englund, who stars as Freddy Krueger, is brought into Stranger Things to star as Victor Creel, who is the initial suspect of the dream murders, essentially is what they are. But yeah, if you haven't watched it yet, the latest season of Stranger Things, brilliant, especially if you're a fan of A Nightmare on Elm Street. So yeah, those are our 3 kind of like slasher franchises. So are you ready to dive into, you know, what makes them gothic?
Yes, although I think maybe first of all, like, just because I think I know this, what makes them a slasher? Like, why is a slasher its own sort of like subgenre of horror?
Okay, so it's essentially where you have an individual who in the course of a film stalks and kills.
So it is essentially like slasher equals serial killer.
Yes, serial killer, but specifically most of the murders happen in a short period of time. They are also often stalked,
which I think technically is a spree killer. I don't know.
Yeah, sure. So in Halloween, what you have is Michael Myers. He escapes from the sanitarium that he had been imprisoned in, and he goes around killing a lot of babysitters in the town, and then eventually kind of comes up against one, as we'll get to. And then in Friday the 13th, you just swap the kind of town setting for a camp. Jason or Pamela Voorhees, you know, whichever film you're looking at, the singular killer kind of goes around the camp killing people, teenagers often. So quite a lot of the time in these films, they're aimed at a teen audience, and a lot of the victims are not always, but quite a lot of the time they're teenagers. And then again in A Nightmare on Elm Street, you have a similar kind of thing. Elm Street is the kind of physical setting, but obviously the location also is just dreams.
Yes.
So you have this weird kind of like reality but also subconsciousness, and Freddy goes around invading people's private dreams, messing with their stuff and killing them, and as you would expect, as a lot of the deaths happen in dreams, they're quite inventive.
Yes,
and
it gives a bit more like, that makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, cool. Yeah, I mostly, like, weirdly, a lot of my understanding of slasher comes from stuff like Scream, which is obviously more 90s, and I think that's just because we're 90s kids. So even though I don't like them, like Scream, I would see people were always watching it at parties and sleepovers. So like, but yes, okay, cool. I am au fait. I know what we're talking about.
Yeah,
Scream's
really great because Scream is essentially operating in a kind of period where slasher films and the traditions and formulas of slasher films was quite well known. So you're like a decade or 2 decades into this, and it's both parody and satire, but also a self-conscious slasher. So you've got lots of jokes about, you know, when certain things are going to happen and who's going to die and what constitutes a victim and all that kind of stuff. I quite like Scream. It's quite fun.
Like I do,
but
Scream is one of those movies where in a lot of ways I enjoy it, but I can't watch the like actual horror scenes.
No, I totally get that. But yeah, like basically Scream is a satire on what these films are kind of establishing and working with the tropes that these films kind of set up.
Yes. Okay, cool. All right. So that's our slasher. Which one are we diving into first?
Okay, so first of all, I want to focus on the idea of the final girl, which is a kind of character type within slasher films, and reading her as a Gothic heroine but reincarnated.
Cool.
So there has already been quite not a lot, but there's been some really good work linking these two kind of character types. And there is a fabulous article on Horror Homeroom, I think by Laura Kreml, and on YouTube I'll put the link somewhere because it's really interesting.
In the description on the pod.
But yeah, I guess I just want to preface this by saying I'm not saying anything new. This is not my idea. Although I guess I did have this idea and then looked to see if anyone had it, and then yes, there are. But I just want to say this isn't necessarily original, but I think that it is interesting.
It's fun, and we talk about fun Gothic things on this show.
So I guess in order to see why a final girl, and I'll define that in a minute, but to see why a final girl is a Gothic heroine, I think maybe we should talk about what a Gothic heroine is.
Yay!
So Lauren, this is where I turn to you, because I'm like, you know Gothic heroines. So what is the kind of quintessential Gothic heroine?
Okay, so the quintessential Gothic heroine, and we're taking you guys right back now to like the 1780s, but I would say most specifically the 1790s, which is fun that like it's literally 1970s and 1790s flipped. And the Gothic heroine is essentially functions as the representation within a Gothic novel of morality, virtue, sensibility, and sometimes often nation. They are a departure from the sensibility heroine, or the heroine of sensibility. The heroine of sensibility is very static. She doesn't do much. She's not able to move herself. So this is characters like Pamela or Clarissa. They're very sort of like, oh, well, Providence will guide me. The Gothic heroine moves within her confines. She knows that she is in a system that does not protect her, and she tries to find ways to protect herself within it. So often I think when we read back things like The Mysteries of Udolpho, which has the most classic example of Gothic heroine, they come across really limp and lame, and we're like, why aren't these women doing anything? But for the time, this is like quite revolutionary that, you know, in Romance of the Forest, Adeline escapes she actually like is like, I need to get out of here because this guy's basically the Marquis de Sade. So the Gothic heroine is usually an orphan, a character generally without protection of a parental guardian, or at least a patriarchal guardian. They are very beautiful, very sensitive and in tune, but very smart, and not willing to compromise their virtues and their values, sometimes in a very conservative way, because some Gothic's very conservative, but often in quite a revolutionary way, because they're young women. They resist the, you know, the violence and the schemes of the Gothic hero, and usually uncover the mystery. The Gothic heroine is usually the one who gets to the bottom of what's behind the black veil. Usually escapes, often without actually the help of the hero. Very rarely does the Gothic heroine actually escape with the help of the hero. It's usually with a friend or a servant. And then obviously at the end, everything is restored. So the Gothic heroine is a very symbolic character in a lot of ways. Like a lot of the Gothic in the 1790s is using her to be the vessel of an idealized woman, but also as a didactic figure. She was a way for women to warn other women about the dangers of the world. So don't fall prey to men like this, and be wary of women like this. So the Gothic heroine's experiences also had like a didactic function. They helped the woman reading the novel to learn from the woman within the novel, and apply those things. So there's always been a sort of like moral virtue learning element to them, and sometimes that's very conservative, and sometimes it's very feminist, sometimes both.
That was excellent, and I knew that you would just encapsulate everything about the Gothic heroine. So yeah, I think that's a really good kind of historical contextualization of the Gothic heroine, and I think there are some key points that I just want to highlight from what you've said, that I think we can then draw out into talking about the final girl. So first of all, this idea of the Gothic heroine as a moral center, and being connected with a virtue, which may or may not be the case, but there's definitely some kind of tension there, at least. The idea of the Gothic heroine as an investigator, and as part of that, her kind of you know, being fearless in going forward and like investigating places. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And then also this idea of sometimes being conservative, sometimes being feminist, there being a bit of a tension, a bit of a tension there. But yeah, so think especially about those kinds of ideas of the Gothic heroine, as we kind of think about final girls.
Who is the final girl?
But I also want to, you know, just mention two quick examples. So you have Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto, which is the kind of, you know, the granddaddy of Gothic texts. And here we have the Gothic heroine Isabella, who is chased around the castle by Manfred. So that idea of Isabella being physically chased by somebody who wants her in his power, and the idea that maybe to survive she also has to escape as well as fight back.
Yeah, and there's a lot of like putting the danger into the domestic space, that like the domestic space can protect women, but the domestic space can also be used to trap women.
Yes. And this idea, you know, if we think about Halloween and the idea of it being, you know, a killer in a haunted house kind of thing, that idea of a specific location that we can all imagine, whether it be, you know, a suburban house or a Gothic castle, we can imagine that and think about, you know, the hallways, the stairs, the tunnels, maybe another house next door, all these kinds of things where you can see ways for heroines to escape when they are being chased. Also, and you also mentioned this as well, but Emily St. Aubert from The Mysteries of Udolpho, I think, is another really great example. She is many times like physically threatened and also chased around, you know, Udolpho by several men, Montoni and Count Morano. So yeah, this idea that, again, bodily women are kind of being threatened, and sometimes they have to actually kind of flee and escape and run away in order to preserve their autonomy, coupled with that kind of, you know, fearless investigative kind of aspect. So yeah, those are my examples that I think are kind of, you know, we can see as influencing the final girl. So then I guess the question is, what is a final girl? So do you have any ideas?
It is the girl who is final. No. No, so the final girl is essentially like the last woman standing at the end of the film, and usually is like responsible for uncovering the killer in some way. And I know there's often also like a very moral element to it, because like one of the things about not just slashers but a lot of horror films, it's like, if you, I know we joked, but if you do a sin, you get the bin, like
yeah so yeah, that's basically it. It's kind of like the person who, I guess, survives and has that kind of final showdown with the slasher killer. So there's a really influential text that kind of coined the idea of the final girl, and it is Carol Clover's Men, Women and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film, which is super influential, and it was published in 1992. So again, in response to the kind of 1970s and 1980s kind of slasher waves. And she suggests that final girls are the sole female survivor of a group, typically teenagers or young adults, who are chased by a slasher villain. She typically gets into a final confrontation with the slasher villain, and here she either kills him or sometimes she's saved at the last minute by someone else. So again, that tension with, you know, how feminist can we read these kind of figures. She's typically, Clover suggests, morally superior, so that unlike her friends in the group who end up killed, Clover suggests that the final girl refuses sex, drugs, and other such behaviors. So one of the reasons is that she survives is because the other people were either targeted first because they're, you know, not moral enough, or maybe because she is moral and because she is smart, she deserves to survive. Which, I mean, I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, and I don't think that every slasher film is suggesting this or doing this. But yeah,
stuff has flipped it really fun. Like I guess, you know, like you mentioned Crimson Peak, like obviously it's not quite the same thing, but spoiler, at the end of Crimson Peak, the like second male lead, shall we say, turns up, instantly gets the shit kicked out of him. She is still the one who saves them and rectifies the situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then like in Stranger Things, Barb gets got by the monster because she's not in the house partying, like, and it's not to say that because she's not doing that, but it kind of like rejects the narrative that some people deserve to be got and some people don't. So yeah, there's some like fun maybe the wrong word, there's some interesting, to use our favorite term, flips on this.
Yeah, and I think, you know, especially as slashers have continued to be made or franchises are continued to be updated, Clover's kind of initial definition has been like kind of revisited and reevaluated. Also, just to finally kind of finish this definition as well, the final girl is essentially the investigative consciousness of the film, and she moves the narrative forward. And therefore, like, she exhibits intelligence, curiosity, and vigilance. So thinking about, you know, Emily St. Aubert, who investigates the castle,
she like rejects the supernatural superstitions, rejects the, like, she's conscious of the danger, but she's like, well, I have to figure it out because I need to know what I'm actually dealing with.
And I think as well, like, you can do a comparison between like Emily investigating the castle at night with a candle, seeing like blood smeared walls and what she thinks is a body, and then the final girl in a slasher film who is wading through rooms of dead bodies and all of that kind of stuff. It's similar things where you're confronted with violence and murder, and you also are personally threatened, but you continue to do things as well. So the thing about the final girl is that obviously not every slasher film has one.
Yes.
Some franchises have what you could argue is a final boy, which obviously kind of has different gender dynamics, but some don't have them at all. And in terms of final girls, and especially when you have franchises that are this long, 9 or 10 films, like what are you expecting someone to survive every single film? So then you come to the kind of the problem of what happens when you kill off final girls, and does that kind of idea and the kind of theoretical concept behind them stand up. But I still think that it's a really good starting point. And as we've kind of said, like there's a lot of overlap with Gothic heroines and that kind of tension between will she survive, will she not, and what is she upholding in terms of conservative or kind of progressive values. So I'm going to suggest 2 quick case studies. The first one being Laurie Strode in Halloween. So Laurie appears in 9 of the films in the Halloween franchise, which is quite a lot considering.
That's a lot of things for the same character to be in.
Yeah, the thing to remember is there are so many different timelines. So
some are set in the past, some are set in the future.
They keep rebooting them. They keep going back to do this. Like so many of the films are just sequels to the first one. Some of them are sequels to the first and second one. You also have the kind of Rob Zombie films that are another thing of itself. You also have Season of the Witch, which is not about Michael Myers or Laurie Strode at all, but it's still a Halloween film.
That's like that's very like, that's like a thing that animate. That's like Neon Genesis Evangelion does. Keeps rebooting the timeline
and
story, but slightly different.
And so the recent spate of Halloween films. So we're in a kind of era of legacy, like reboots or remakes or kind of legacy sequels, where so I think in the kind of late noughties, early kind of 2010s, there was this idea of like remaking these films as quite gritty serious films. And now what we're getting is kind of, I guess, legacy sequels where so the latest kind of Halloween film is a direct sequel to the first Halloween film, and it picks up with Laurie Strode as a grandma, which I think is really interesting. But before we get, let's just look at why Laurie Strode in the original film is a final girl / Gothic heroine kind of thing. So she is sometimes, but not always, depicted as Michael Myers' sister, depending on the timeline, which I don't think really impacts whether you consider her as a final girl or not. But she's initially always kind of smart. She's a 17-year-old high school student, and she's also like really responsible, and she shows this through her babysitting. She's a regular babysitter, and you see on Halloween, like in the film, you see quite a lot of different babysitters, and some of them aren't as responsible as her. So she's definitely kind of,
this is Jamie Lee Curtis, isn't it?
This is Jamie Lee Curtis, yeah. She's so good, and she's great in these films. I love Jamie Lee Curtis. But yeah, the idea of Halloween is that they constantly bring Laurie back to face off against Michael, and to some degree Laurie always wins. So even though Michael comes back, when he does, she's there and she
it.
Yeah, exactly.
She's like Van Helsing.
Exactly, yeah. So the recent kind of film, which the trio of films where you have Halloween Kills, and Halloween Ends. The first one of that Halloween was released in 2018, and Laurie, as you would expect in 2018, is an alcoholic loner whose life cannot be separated from the trauma that she experienced on the first Halloween night. I think the first in this trio of installments is absolutely the best. Over the course of the film, she reconnects with her somewhat estranged daughter and also her granddaughter. And then together, what you get is a kind of generational unity and female strength, where they all band together to defeat Michael,
so
which I think
like
is
the slasher Gilmore Girls.
Yeah, exactly. And I just think this idea of, like, you know, building on that kind of Laurie Strode as a final girl, then kind of showing the trauma of that and the reality of that, but also how that can be in some ways a strength, and again connecting to that kind of feminist core of female power, and fighting back against, I guess, in that way, if you're reading Michael Myers as a kind of patriarchal villain, it's very kind of like, yes, this is great. At the end of the film, they leave him for what they think is for dead, and then they set the house on fire. Of course, Michael keeps coming back, and in my opinion, the second and the third films basically dilute this, and unpick the feminist legacy. And the third one is just not very good.
Yeah, it kind of bombed, didn't it?
It was so bad. And I just there was a good film in there, but it wasn't a Halloween film, and I think it just made the film that was there bad, and it then also made the Halloween kind of franchise bad. And I just thought they should have not done this film. And the first one, like I said, the first one is really good, especially in what it does with the idea of having three final girls, where you have a grandma, a mum, and a daughter. Like, that's banging. Like, you can't top that. Why would you want to try?
A good idea, like, especially because, like, within the Gothic, we have a lot of like obviously often the Gothic heroine is without family, but often she'll discover a cousin or a sister or a female friend who she gets to like share her trauma with, essentially. Like they often will discover, you know, female camaraderie, and I guess there's like that extension because the Gothic is about continuing that folklore tradition of don't go into the woods because the big bad wolf will eat you, which actually, you know, that's a grandma telling a mother to tell a granddaughter. Like, there's all of that kind of like that aspect of the Gothic as like female knowledge sharing.
Yeah, exactly.
Lovely.
No, and that's really why I loved that first installment of the recent franchise, and I think why I've
let's just pretend it's the onny one. We'll just reject the others.
Yeah. If you have other opinions, then let us know, but I know that I'm right, so. Snap. Okay. So then, so coming back to earlier where you were like, what was this film based on? I just want to quickly kind of segue to another film. There's still part of my case study of Laurie Strode, but also, I guess, just some interesting backstory. So here, what I want to do is mention a film called Black Christmas. Now, have you heard of this film?
Yes.
Okay. So this film was released in 1974, which is before Halloween. Do you know what it's about?
No. And is this one of the ones that's also got remade, didn't it? Black Christmas.
Yeah. It went through that whole cycle of remakes this kind of century. But okay, so my favorite thing about Black Christmas is that it stars Olivia Hussey, just because I love Olivia Hussey, and she's amazing. And this film,
she's someone we don't talk about enough anymore.
I know, right?
Shout out to Olivia Hussey.
Yes. She's also in the miniseries of It, which I discovered.
Is she?
Yeah. As a grown-up Bill's wife, actress wife. Yeah. Anyway, that was a segue, but yeah, Olivia Hussey is great. Watch all the things that she's in. But yeah, okay, so Black Christmas. Yeah. but okay, Black Christmas is in part inspired by urban legends, and specifically the babysitter and the man upstairs. So this legend is essentially, there's a babysitter and she hears the phone ring, she answers the phone, and there's someone being quite horrible to her, and there's lots of different versions, but essentially she gets on the phone with the police, and it turns out that the call is coming from inside the house. So someone in the house that she's there babysitting for is ringing her and being mean and intimidating, and then essentially murders her and all that kind of stuff. But this film kind of takes that idea of this kind of person in the house and the phone calls, and it sets it in a sorority house.
Oh, okay.
With a group of sorority sisters, including Olivia Hussey, obviously. And they start to receive threatening phone calls, and then they're eventually stalked and murdered by a deranged killer who has escaped from a sanitarium, and it's set during Christmas. So there's lots of aspects. If you watch this film and then watch the original Halloween, you can see even in the kind of camera shots, the way that it's shot, where it's clearly a massive influence. So the things that Halloween is often credited for, where you have Michael Myers stalking Laurie Strode and the use of camera to kind of show the killer's perspective, that actually comes from Black Christmas. But what you also have is a centering of Olivia Hussey's character, and she's called Jess. I should probably start referring to her by her actual name. But
Julia, Olivia.
I think it shines a spotlight on women and the importance of female agency and bodily autonomy. So obviously you have the context of the slasher film, which is the fact that you have often a man, not always, but someone who is coming in, not just invading personal space, but denying you bodily autonomy.
Yeah, especially like setting it in a sorority house, and like babysitting is such a like that was my first job. Like it's a lot of how young women like save up to go to university and stuff like that. I did just look it up because it was triggering something in my memory. That urban legend that came out mostly from the 60s is partially inspired by the death of a girl called Janet Christman, who was babysitting a 3-year-old. I knew I'd read something about like the true story behind the urban legend. So like even that though, to say that like there was actually I think she was like 13, like there was a young woman at the heart of this urban legend that's now become the basis like for these slasher films.
And it's exactly like you say, like the idea that these are domestic spaces that should be safe havens for women, but they're being invaded and threatened. The space itself becomes then a terrifying space. Where do you go? Where do you hide? How do you escape? But also then, like, as a person who is part of that domesticity, whether it is because you're babysitting or because you're a sorority sister or because you're a camp counselor or any kind of thing, like I think there's this other this is added element as a woman where it's amplifying themes of bodily autonomy and loss of control,
the paradox of the domestic space, that like the man, traditionally the domestic space, like the patriarchal head sits at the top of the domestic space, but the domestic space is managed by women, and women have the real control in the domestic space, but then like obviously don't have full agency over it. Like
and these are some of the themes that are kind of picked up again in the remake, which is good. So if you are interested in slasher films and haven't seen these films, I would definitely say watch this one first and then go and watch the remake. But what I really like about this one is that Jess, who is the kind of survivor of the film, although at the end of the film they catch the wrong killer, the real killer is still in the house, the police leave, and it's kind of like, what's going to happen? But in the middle of the film, Jess has a conversation with her boyfriend, who is an absolute tool, but basically where she says, I'm pregnant and I'm going to have an abortion. And I think, this was a film that was made in the 70s. They didn't necessarily have to include that in there, but it is. And I think this is just another trend where, Gothic texts and horror texts are spaces for women to talk about, women's things that are important to women, and how it relates to bodily autonomy.
So I guess it kind of goes back to that thing again where like the final girl, even when she's put into a conservative narrative, still can have positive female agency, because by by giving a woman that power within your narrative, consciously or unconsciously, you are enabling an element of female agency that your conservative setting doesn't necessarily intend to give her. Or like, it's like how Buffy is still something that we can watch and feel inspired by, despite the fact that Joss Whedon deserves to be punched in the dick multiple times.
I co-sign. But yeah, so this was my kind of segue into talking about Black Christmas and just how I think it just adds to this kind of where we can see the legacy of the Gothic in these kinds of horror films. But okay, finally, my second kind of case study is Nancy Thompson, who is played by Heather Langenkamp in the A Nightmare on Elm Street film series. So Nancy has often been regarded as one of the most influential horror heroines, and Sharon Keating has also described Nancy as one of the most progressive female representations in the teen horror genre. And part of this is because Wes Craven basically tried to address and correct some of the criticisms that he'd had from his previous films, and in particular he had a conversation with his daughter, who was, oh my
god, the things that happen when men speak to women,
right? And
how many times do you get that where it's like, well, I was getting all this criticism saying that like my women were unrealistic or like, you know, not very positive, you know, feminist representations, and then I spoke to my wife, daughter, sister, female friend, and for the first time said, how do you feel about these things?
It's exactly that. So yeah, basically his daughter, who is called Jessica, she criticized him over his clumsy depiction of the heroine in his earlier film Swamp Thing, which came out in 1982. And she also like specifically focused on one scene in which the heroine stereotypically trips and falls over nothing. And this is what Jessica said: you know, just because I'm a girl doesn't mean I'm clumsy. You don't have to have them falling down. Which I think, like it's like that scene in that Jurassic Park remake.
Oh my god!
Where, like she keeps on her heels. It's like, no, just take your heels off. Like,
babe. You know what also really bothers me? This is kind of off topic, but I feel like it might happen in. I don't think it is a Jurassic Park, but when a girl's got heels on in a movie where they have to run and they pull, like the dude is like pulls the heel off the heel. That's not how they work. Just because the stiletto is not on there doesn't mean it's a flat shoe. That's not how that works. They're angled. Like, don't get me wrong, running in heels is a skill that I admire in any woman. But I would not be like, I'll just keep my shoes on if a freaking T-Rex was chasing me.
Yeah, I know. I just think
so. That shit hurts your calves. You're gonna be in pain. You're gonna get like, you know, cramps in the next 2 seconds.
Yeah, and I commend Wes Craven for talking to, and more importantly, listening to his daughter, taking on that criticism. But I would also say, like, don't just talk to one woman. Like, you need to have more than one woman in your life, and you need a kind of variety of perspectives.
Well, and input. You wouldn't do a clinical trial with one person.
No. So yeah, go and to any aspiring like writers out there for whatever mode, film, literature, poetry, drama, whatever, if you're writing women and you're not a woman, or if you're writing any kind of like person, just go and talk to the people that you're trying to represent, and get their feedback
and listen
and take it on board. And but okay, so Wes Craven tried to right this wrong, and he also, one of the things that he said was that this was just a common kind of like established trope. So what he then tried to do was to then set up more tropes that could then become the new kind of common and established tropes.
So kind of like what happens like when you shift out of the 18th century Gothic into the 19th century Gothic, like, okay, these are the tropes, these are the conventions, everybody knows them.
Yeah.
What happens if we add this thing in? Like, because
or we subvert this thing.
Yeah, which makes sense because it's like what, 5 years? What did you say? 84? 1984?
Yeah.
So like 5 years after the first Halloween movie.
Yeah.
And also between 1979 and like 1984, a hell of a lot of shit had changed. Like, I think that's something that maybe we don't think about as like millennials and maybe Gen Z, but the shift from the end of the 70s to the early mid 80s, you go from like progress and civil rights and blossoming feminism to like Thatcherism and Reaganism and televangelists and the freaking satanic panic. Like,
exactly. Yeah. And this is why I think, as I said at the start, Gothic is not the only way to approach slasher films, but I think when you do approach it specifically in terms of like feminism or in terms of the representation of women, I think there's a really kind of like rich centuries long kind of tradition that you can like tap into that's really interesting to see how it's progressed and also how
as a model that responds to contemporary anxieties.
But exactly, and to see how horror, especially because it's primarily a visual media, like how horror then addresses and responds to and subverts some of those kind of Gothic things. But yeah, okay, so Nancy is then essentially the kind of arch enemy of Freddy Krueger, who, as we said, massive paedophile.
And he's the one with the Bernie face, right?
Yeah.
And the big hand.
And the thing about
more upsetting when he's a paedophile.
Yeah, well, you might be thinking, and I think there's a lot of valid criticism about Nightmare on Elm Street in its depiction of burn victims, just as there's a lot of valid criticism of Halloween in its depiction of people that are mentally ill, and also the same with Friday the 13th in terms of its depiction of people who are physically disfigured. But yeah, the main thing about Freddy Krueger is he's a paedophile, and I think that like his physical appearance isn't necessarily as horrifying.
So it's meant to be like that who he chooses to be as a person is his defining characteristic as a villain.
But the important thing here is that Nancy not only is the one who kind of stands up against him, but she works out how he works as a sleep demon thing, and figures out how to fight him and comes up with a plan. So she realizes that it's her fear that is empowering Freddy. So she just literally takes it back and is like, I am not afraid of you anymore. She also realizes that she can pull him out of her dreams and into the real world. And then in the real world, she can kill him. So she sets up this whole elaborate kind of like Home Alone style plan where she booby traps her house, and then successfully lures him into a trap. And that's how, in the first film, spoiler, that's how she defeats him. She survives, and then she returns in the third installment, A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, where she then also helps. It
sounds like a children's television show. like when I was a kid, we had like She-Ra, Princess of Power, and Princess Starla and the Jewel Riders, and then Freddy Krueger and the Dream Warrior.
But here she essentially like helps to guide a new group of teenagers to defeat Freddy by harnessing their own dream powers, which is, I guess, in terms of inheriting and passing on her ability, that kind of thing. But I think that the idea that Nancy is really important, and builds on that idea of the final girl as someone who we can be. She's,
well, I guess it's kind of like the smarts thing as well. Like the thing about the Gothic heroine is supposed to be that like even though she's physically weak, which again like kind of problematic, but it is the 1790s, but the whole thing about the Gothic heroine is that even though she faints and she swoons and she is physically weak, she's mentally very strong, and that means that she is able to uncover these things and read documents and figure it out, and she like is able to work out what the villain wants and you know, foil their plans, and as that goes on they get better and better and better at doing that, and obviously sometimes do come up with like plans and schemes and stuff, which I think that's, you know, that's unfortunately still such a big thing, particularly for like young female viewers, to see a female character who is able to I guess the difference with the final girl is she does have physical agency, because she can, like, doesn't matter that she's not as strong, she can trap them, she can do this, and then she can still take that, you know, she can make the most of it, which is, I guess, I just keep thinking, obviously this is why Nancy in Stranger Things is called Nancy. That bitch can shoot a gun.
oh yeah absolutely. Like, Nancy is great, and I think that it's exactly that. Like, yeah, you have like Freddy Krueger in the late season, but Nancy's already been there because she's a badass bitch.
I like that. I like that you described her as like his arch nemesis.
Yeah,
that, like, that's because usually you think of like arch nemesis and it's like freaking Sherlock Holmes and Mycroft, not Mycroft, that's his brother, Moriarty.
yeah.
Not like a sleep demon and a teenage girl.
I know. Which, okay, so this brings me to the end of my Gothic heroine section, and I have two more kind of sections that I think we can run through quite quickly. Cool. But I just say this because there is another film in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise that is also about Nancy that I think is really interesting, and yeah, I want to kind of get to that if we can. But yeah, so are you ready for the next bit? Okay, so this is going to be slightly different, and what I want to do is look at the Gothic legacy of dreams.
Okay.
And specifically how these elements kind of add a metatextual aspect to the films, and also kind of draw on this idea of Gothic play in terms of transgressing boundaries. So I think it's pretty obvious. I probably don't need to talk that much more about like A Nightmare on Elm Street in terms of the basics as to what this is doing. You know, it's a sleep demon. It's a kind of thing that invades your dreams, and therefore there's like, you know, the narrative world centers on transgressing the boundaries of reality, and the way that Freddy stalks his victims, the dreams that he's then able to manipulate, the things that he does, that he transforms into in the dreams, the deaths of people. They're very imaginative, creative, and not bound to kind of natural kind of rules and all those kinds of things. I think it's just inherently Gothic.
Yeah, I guess, because like the whole thing about the Gothic is like the transgression of boundaries.
Yeah.
And making you feel unsafe in spaces that you're supposed to be safe. Like, because how do you not dream? You can't, because if you don't sleep then you're gonna die anyway.
Yeah. But and it's exactly that. You know, I think just the concept of A Nightmare on Elm Street is exactly that. It's so Gothic and supernatural. But I also think this idea of dreams, we can link it back to the you know, the conception of the Castle of Otranto, and how Horace Walpole's initial dream of, you know, somebody getting crushed by a giant helmet influenced his novel. And then the way that, you know, if we move forward a little bit more, like Mary Shelley had dreams, and her dreams then, you know, of this kind of figure that was created then became Frankenstein, added a kind of metatextual layer to these texts, and also a bit where you're like, are the dreams, did that actually happen, or are you just making this up? I don't know. Not going to trust anything that Horace Walpole says. Like, you know, he's one to commit to a bit.
You know who else had a dream and then wrote a text about something that may or may not be Gothic? I mean, Stephanie Meyer, when she wrote Twilight.
I mean, it's just the thing that people do, right?
No, but it's true. Like, I mean, I like Twilight's super problematic for so many reasons, and maybe one day we'll talk about it. But it still does a lot of the things that were very key about the Gothic, and one of those big things, it was for women by a woman. Like, it created female sorority and friendship, and other people started writing because of it. So even that, like, if that dream story she tells is true, then the resurgence of young adult vampire fiction, which some of it's very good, it's not Twilight, but some, as in Twilight's not good, but that book sparked this new fury in that, and that was also sparked by a dream.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. But yeah, so I want to think about this idea of the metatextuality of dreams. And also I think here we can think about James Hogg, and Confessions of a Justified Sinner. And basically in the context of Hogg inserting himself into the narrative as a very interesting character. He's written this whole novel, and yet him talks in a dialect. It's really interesting, really funny.
So just for those people who might not know, when we say metatextual, can you just, like, what do we mean?
Oh god, that's like, how do you define that? I always think of meta as things that are self-aware, parodic, but also self-referential. So in the way that if you have, for example, Confessions of a Justified Sinner, which is a novel, and then the author writes himself in to that novel in a way that maybe reflects reality but maybe doesn't. But then you also have to think about, so is this narrative real, or are you a character, and all of those kinds of things. You also get this idea where you have like TV shows within TV shows.
It's like multiplicity, things that reference themselves. So, like, for those of you, like, some people might know, for example, metadata. The metadata is the things that you don't necessarily see on a site but influence it and build it. So metatext is the additional things, the thing within the thing, the fact that the thing wants you to think of it as a thing. So you know it's a novel, but it tells you it's a manuscript that was found somewhere. It's that kind of meta.
I'm gonna use a Supernatural episode as an example.
What?
So Supernatural.
Are you gonna talk about the one where they find the show of them?
No. So Supernatural is a show about Dean and Sam, played by Jensen Ackles and Jared Padalecki, where they are monster hunters. And in the episode The French Mistake, they get put through a kind of portal thing, and Sam and Dean, played by Jared Padalecki and Jensen Ackles, end up in a universe where Supernatural is a TV show. And people keep calling them Jared Padalecki and Jensen Ackles, and they are essentially Jared Padalecki and Jensen Ackles playing Sam and Dean, who are in a universe where Supernatural is a TV show, and they are thought to be these actors playing these characters. And it's just very confusing but very hilarious.
Well, it's the age-old joke from Shakespeare where you've got a man, because there were men on stage, no women. Like in Twelfth Night, you've got a man playing a woman who in the play is pretending to be her twin brother. Like, the audience knows the layer of the joke, but the people within the text don't know, but it adds to the audience's entertainment.
Yes.
Cool.
Which brings me to Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which was a film that was released in 1994, and it is part of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. And basically, this film is set in the real world, where there is a horror franchise, Nightmare on Elm Street.
Okay.
And it stars Wes Craven and Heather Langenkamp, Wes Craven being the famous writer and director of A Nightmare on Elm Street, and Heather Langenkamp being the actor that plays Nancy in the films A Nightmare on Elm Street. Heather Langenkamp has a son, and she also has a stalker, and the studio are trying to convince her to come back to make another Nightmare on Elm Street film, which obviously you're thinking, but you are making a Nightmare on Elm Street film? So this is the meta thing, and she's kind of very reluctant, she's hesitant to do this. At the same time, her son keeps having all these weird dreams. Her son's also having these weird dreams. Stuff keeps happening. And essentially what ends up happening is that Craven tells her that she is the target of an ancient entity who is taking on a scarier form of Freddy Krueger, and that as Nancy is Freddy's original nemesis, this being sees Heather Langenkamp as his nemesis, and kind of Heather has to become one with Nancy and save her son within this dream that's also part of the script, that's also part of and it's just so weird, but also probably my favorite film of
I mean, that does sound like a really fun idea for a movie.
It sounds great, and it has, you know, like it has so many kind of like nods to the original films and references to the filming of it, and you know, all of these kinds of things. It's very fun, it's very playful. So you have this idea of like Gothic play where you're playing with boundaries. Sometimes it's transgressing boundaries in terms of like evil and the monstrous, but sometimes it's just playing with, you know, what's real and what's not. And you know, this idea of Heather Langenkamp in the film being reluctant to come back is also reflecting the fact that she wasn't necessarily happy with the kind of the third installment where she did come back, and she, you know, all of this kind of stuff. And it's just so meta, and it's all centered on dreams, and I just think that it's just really fun and Gothic.
Yes, definitely. Like, considering especially that, like, you know, Gothic texts interact with each other, like the monk is responding to Udolpho, and then the Italian is responding back to the monk, and then you get the rip-offs of Udolpho, and then you get Northanger Abbey, and then you get Nightmare Abbey, and that's super Gothic.
I love it. And it's also, you know, it's in a period where you get a film called Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and you get Bram Stoker's Dracula, and here you have Wes Craven's New Nightmare, and you know, centering the dream or the nightmare,
like consciously playing with
it's so self-conscious and self-referential. It's unbelievable. But
love that for him.
I remember when I read the kind of synopsis, and I was like, I'm sorry, what?
What?
And it sounds like it shouldn't work, but also it works so well. It's such a good film, and it's so meta is very easy to do not well, but this is
like
well
I guess
done.
if you lean into the Gothic is what makes that kind of thing possible, because the Gothic works on campness, and it works on subversion, and it also works on that metatextuality of like, you know, and I know that this is fake, but what if it's not? Like, it gets that uncanny element to it. It's got the familiarity. You're aware of also things that are outside of the film, like that she wasn't happy with the third one, or that this is the fandom. Like, you know, that only works if you embrace the Gothicness of it rather than just the slasher and the horror elements of it,
which is quite a nice kind of segue into my final kind of thing that I want to look at, which is, are slasher killers natural killers, or are they supernatural?
Okay.
So I think, you know, A Nightmare on Elm Street, we don't have to really ask that. You know, Freddy is
he's a dream demon.
He's a dream demon. But at the start, you made a distinction between Freddy and Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees. Because I guess you have this impression that they are natural, you know, typical.
Yes. I think, like, obviously I knew that I couldn't remember which one was which, but I knew that one of them existed in dreams and was like a dream demon. But like that the rest of them were like natural. And I guess in my limited understanding of slasher, the basic understanding I've had is like that they're realistic to an extent. Like, obviously they come at the end of the 70s into the early 80s, which is after the Manson family and like the Son of Sam and Ed Kemper, and people, you know, it's this serial killer crisis, so to speak. And and that very, very real fear towards the end of the 70s and in the 80s of who was on the streets and who was in your home. So I guess I do think of them as being natural, despite the fact that they come back.
Yeah, so that's the crux of it, isn't it? And I think this is what I want to kind of problematize, because I think exactly that, like, they're kind of the concept of them and what we think of them definitely inspired by real murders or by real kind of happenings and everything, and there is that kind of fear that of the person on the street, or it is a big part of why slasher films are scary. But I also think that, you know, these are kind of three major franchises, and in my opinion, all three of the slasher killers are supernatural entities.
Well, let's be honest, they have to be.
Yeah,
because one, they'd be like old men by now.
yeah.
But two, I guess, like,
and yeah, they do age, you know, somewhat, but
it's not realistic to have, I mean, like, James Bond doesn't have the same villain pop. I mean, sometimes they do come back, but like, I think that's the thing, isn't it? Like, if these weren't Gothic, you wouldn't be able to have the same suspension of disbelief without a clearly defined supernatural element. But because they are Gothic and then part of Gothic horror, it means you don't actually have to have a supernatural element to have them come back again, because the suspension of disbelief and the acceptance that within this genre the supernatural can exist and fear has power.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't have to be like, well, how the heck did he, like, obviously that's why some people don't like them, but the question of how the hell did this guy survive 7 times doesn't really come into play. You don't have to explain the science.
So this is the thing about Michael Myers, is that, so he's known as the boogeyman, but he's also known as the shape, which I think gives, you know, leaves a lot of questions unanswered.
Well, it's like
in terms of
the urban legend thing, isn't it?
Sure. And he seems able to survive any kind of attack. So, you know, he's burned alive several times, and he's attacked in ways that should kill any normal human, but he doesn't die. So there is clearly something that is inhuman or non-human about him. I also want to just quickly mention one of the very many timelines, and this is the Jamie Lloyd story arc, which is established in the 4th, 5th, and 6th Halloween films. So you have Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, and Halloween 5, The Revenge of Michael Myers, and then it's concluded with the 6th installment, which is Halloween, The Curse of Michael Myers, emphasis on curse. So this film stars Paul Rudd, which I was personally delighted to discover.
Paul Rudd!
Yes, Paul Rudd.
I mean, he's a supernatural entity as it is, because he hasn't aged. So
basically Dorian Gray. But yeah, so here in this timeline, at least, so these 3 films, and I think the original, the first film, oh no, actually I think it takes the first 2 films and then follows on with this timeline. It reveals the source of Michael's immortality and also his drive to kill. So essentially, you might be pleased to hear this, there's a cult.
Hey, I freaking love a cult.
Yeah, so Michael Myers is the product of the Thorn cult, which is a druid-like cult that has cursed him with the Thorn, which basically makes him an evil entity. And it causes him to kill his bloodline on Halloween night. And once his bloodline's been erased, then stuff will happen. So yeah, Michael Myers is essentially pure evil, and his whole bloodline is cursed, which to me sounds pretty Gothic.
I mean, that's like the sort of one of the founding notions of the Gothic is you do sin, whole family in the bin.
Yeah. And especially, you know, the 6th one as well, there's lots of kind of like cult stuff there, and it's very interesting and quite different, I think, to some of the other Halloween ones. Now let's turn to my favorite, which is Friday the 13th. So obviously, as I said to you, like the first film, Jason is not the killer
Mhm.
because Jason died as a child and his mum, Pamela Voorhees, is the killer. And what happens at the end of this film, and I think is really interesting, and I haven't found anyone talking about this, but I think this is really fascinating, is I think Pamela Voorhees basically conjures her son back to life.
Like her hatred, like,
So
brings
yeah,
them back.
she and there's a lot of kind of discussion as to whether Alice in Friday the 13th is a final girl, but Alice is the last girl standing and the last person standing. They have a fight on the beach. She basically decapitates Pamela. So win for Alice, you know, not a great trip to the beach for Pamela, all of that kind of stuff. But in this kind of very violent murder, and also in Pamela's emotion, in that she has been doing all of these killings to avenge her son, who was himself very violently killed on Crystal Lake, I think there's some kind of magical conjuration that happens, that then he, as a man, for some reason, walks out of the lake and then is able to, in the second film,
start killing,
take up the killings. And he, in the second film, is haunted by his mother, and there's all of these, you know, kill for mummy Jason,
oh my god,
kind of awful kind of things. He also
takes
her head in a very it's very Psycho-esque. He takes her head, which is rotting, and her like kind of cardigan jumper thing, and has it in a shack, and makes this kind of shrine and talks to the head and all of this kind of thing. But the other thing that I notice is that every single film, which obviously happens on Friday the 13th, also happens on a full moon. So again, I'm like, there has to be something supernatural here.
Yeah,
that is calling Jason and his mother, and this kind of,
yeah, I guess it's kind of like, and this is something that the Gothic was doing, like even the non-supernatural, like the explained supernatural Gothic, like Radcliffe, has those moments where like Adeline reads the manuscript left by her dead father, and she like has an out of body, like transcendent, almost like seance like experience. Like I think there's something that the Gothic enables where, because fear and anxiety is such a big part of it, you can introduce supernatural potentiality without actually ever having, because I know a lot of people don't, I had forgotten this, but that's why a lot of people don't like the 4th, 5th and 6th Halloween, right? Because they were like, oh, here's a supernatural cult, and everyone was like, you've ruined it. Like I guess is that
always there. It's always there though.
You want always the suggestion but not the explanation. Sure, because it's not scary if you explain it too much.
But I think even the suggestion, it's the thing is, in Halloween, in whatever timeline you're looking at, it's not just the suggestion, because the reality is that this person is able to sustain injuries that should kill him.
Impossible. Also, if there's multiple timelines, then because even if you're saying, well, I'm rebooting, the audience still has the, not like, if we're talking about metatextuality, that audience is like, yeah, but I saw those films.
It's haunted by all of the previous iterations. But yeah, so this is why I think that all of these kinds of, you know, at least these 3 big ones are supernatural. And just to end, because I know that we both love Frankenstein,
don't we ever?
The 6th installment of Friday the 13th, which is Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives. I think we can read it as a Frankensteinian narrative.
Yeah.
So the film begins with Tommy Jarvis, who is one of the main kind of recurring survivors in the franchise. Some people talk about him as a kind of final boy. Some people just talk about him in other kinds of ways. He basically accidentally resurrects Jason.
That's wonderful.
So
what if we said about reading the Latin?
Well, he doesn't do it on purpose, because, and this is why, again, I think like the kind of the setting and nature is really important. So he's basically feeling really anxious that Jason is going to come back, and, you know, he's already killed all my friends once, or, you know, I can't remember how many times at this point, but, you know, he's already killed all my friends, threatened me many, many times. I want to make sure that he's actually dead. So he goes to the cemetery where Jason is buried. He digs him up with the with the idea that what I'm going to do is I'm going to completely destroy the body, and that's going to put to rest all
I
of
love
my
the
fears.
idea that a serial killer would be buried in a cemetery.
Yeah.
This is look, listen, America, this is why you should cremate.
Well, there's lots of different factors with that. Some religious, some practical, whatever. Not judging here, but all I'm saying is that Jason was buried. Tommy goes to dig him up, gets kind of I think he gets caught, and some stuff happens, and essentially then there's a storm, there's lots of thunder,
hit by lightning,
and Jason gets hit by lightning and then is resurrected.
That's so Shelley.
Yeah, full moon, obviously, because as I've said, there's a full moon in every single film. But yeah,
I mean, the chances of every Friday 13th don't happen that often, but for them to also be full moons, I think it happens. There was one not too long ago, but it happens quite infrequently.
Yeah, but that's the whole point of the Gothic, is you have to suspend your disbelief.
You do, and I guess it's kind of pathetic fallacy as well. I know full moons aren't weather, but they have it's a natural thing with implications to the narrative that suggest things may happen.
Yeah. Well, that is my episode on slasher films. Thank you for surviving till the end.
Thanks, I loved it. Which is hilarious considering that apart from parts of Scream, I've literally never watched a slasher movie. The thing is, I don't dislike them. It's not I don't like the narrative. I was already chicken shit, and now I'm a traumatized chicken shit.
I think it's fine. Everyone has their own kind of comfort levels and things that they want to watch, or things that they don't. And
what I really want is so when you play video games, they give you easy they call it story mode or hard mode. I want horror or slasher films where it's I'm just watching for the story.
Yeah. Well, I made
it was turn the page here and maybe I could just read what happens and then I start at the next scene.
Yeah, well, hopefully this has been a little kind of mini dive into some of the stories. Yeah, and now you feel these three big slasher franchises and you don't ever need to watch them.
I don't need to watch them. I have my knowledge.
But if you are watching or listening and you are a fan of slasher films, then let us know. Have you got any favorites that we've not talked about? Or if you haven't watched any slasher franchises but you want to, then let us know if you do watch any of these.
And as ever, if you ever think I want you guys to talk about this particular thing, or did you know about this thing, then you can let us know, and one of us will research it, because we have got some ideas for shows coming up. But yeah, our interests are quite broad. And essentially we made this podcast intentionally vague so that we could talk about whatever we wanted.
So as always, follow us, tweet us at the Ghoul Guides.
You can also find us on Ko-fi if you ever want to support us. We'll include the links. And fireworks just started outside my house, so this is a great time to stop. I don't know if you're going to be able to hear that or not, but in the meantime, as ever, from us, stay safe and stay spooky.
Stay safe and stay spooky.